It was September 19th, 1999, and 48-year-old Susan Fassett just knew in her bones that her own personal day of reckoning was coming. As soon as Susan stepped out of church that morning and away from the tight knot of friends all busy saying goodbye to each other, the too bright smile on her face was instantly replaced by the lines of strain and worry that seemed to get deeper every time she looked in the mirror. There was just no getting around it. Over the last 4 years, Susan had made a terrible mess of her life, and now she and her husband of 24 years would have to pay for their mistakes. The day was coming, or maybe it was already here, when she and Jeff would have to look, together and deeply, into the neglected and now poisoned core of their 24-year-long marriage. As Susan walked, pulled out her car keys, and headed towards her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee, she barely noticed the bright sun glowing through the leaves of the maple and oak trees in the woods beyond the parking lot. When she and Jeff had first moved to the tiny town of Pleasant Valley with its 9,000 residents, Susan had thought it was one of the most beautiful places on earth. And it was, with its rolling hills and acres of cornfields stitched with old colonial-style homes set on nice big lots. Pleasant Valley was one of those places that actually lived up to its name. And for Susan and Jeff, the location was perfect. They could live and raise their family in a safe, quiet, affluent community where everyone knew and watched out for one another. And the city where they both worked, the town of Poughkeepsie, 10 miles to the north, was just a 20-minute commute away. But now, Pleasant Valley, like everything else in Susan's life, felt tainted and claustrophobic, like these beautiful walls were slowly closing in on her. Climbing into her car, Susan's shoulders slumped. The problems in her marriage had probably started a long time ago. Her job as a personnel director at Poughkeepsie Town Hall and Jeff's grueling overnight shift as a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department had left them with so little time for one another. And now that their oldest son, Jason, was 20 and their younger son, Christopher, was 17, Susan and Jeff were no longer bound together by all these shared responsibilities of the children's school and sports and social activities. But in the last 5 years, something much worse than two people drifting apart had also happened. Because for Susan, her work, or at least the person she had met through her work, had also led her to break the wedding vows she had made so happily 24 years earlier when she promised to be faithful to her husband no matter what. Even now, after so many years that the affair felt almost as normal as her marriage, when Susan actually thought about what she was doing, she still felt shocked that these were the choices she had made. And when she said it all out loud to herself, "I am cheating on my husband, I am having an affair, Jeff does not deserve this," she knew absolutely that what she was doing was wrong. And yet, she had not stopped. She meant to stop. Every day she meant to stop. But armed with that good intention, telling herself that every meeting and every call with her lover would definitely be the last, the affair had just dragged on. And over time, Susan had told herself that the excitement and attention she got from outside her marriage actually made it possible for her to stay in her marriage. It somehow made up for the lack of emotional connection she felt she had with Jeff, and the fact that she and Jeff worked opposite schedules. She worked days, he worked nights, although that too was Susan's fault. But now, word had gotten around Poughkeepsie Town Hall that Susan was stepping out on Jeff, and worst of all, Jeff himself had recently confronted her affair partner, and despite her lover's denials, and Susan's own denials, her pretend outrage had sounded false and hollow, even to her. Just 10 minutes after driving out of the parking lot of the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church, Susan had arrived home. As she turned away from her car and started walking through the thick carpet of fallen leaves, she noted how the outside of the cranberry red house that she shared with Jeff looked as neglected and in need of maintenance as their own marriage. A moment later, standing at the front door, Susan steeled herself, arranging her features into an expression that appeared refreshed and relaxed, the way she wanted to feel after going to church. Then she opened the door, put down her coat and purse in the hallway, and then stepped into the living room to say what would sound like a cheery hello to Jeff. But instantly, before they had even exchanged a single word, Susan could feel the tension that hung between them, and even without seeing his face, she could sense Jeff's hurt and distrust. And lately, there had been something else in Jeff's expression too. Something hard and knowing in how Jeff looked at her, the way he turned away from her in mild disgust. Just for a moment, as Susan hovered on the threshold of the room where her husband sat waiting for her, Susan wondered how other people in Pleasant Valley saw her. She knew that from the outside at least, she seemed like the last person who would be having an affair, let alone an affair that had grown as complicated as this one had somehow become. To friends and family, Susan was the quintessential mom, wife, and working woman. She was a college-educated professional who was up early in the morning and busy most nights until she went to bed. An attractive woman with curly white blonde hair, oversized glasses, a tiny but somehow appealing overbite, and a solid build, Susan mostly stood out as someone who was always willing to help other people, whether it was through her various community and church activities or in response to a direct request, even if that request came from a total stranger. In fact, except for her height, Susan was over 6 feet tall, Susan knew there was nothing about her that seemed at all out of the ordinary. At work, she was competent, well-liked, and respected, and outside of work, her daily routines seemed as transparent and predictable as her ready smile and generally upbeat attitude. On Monday nights, she attended a jazzercise class at Pleasant Valley's Jewish Community Center. On Thursday evenings, Susan attended choir practice, and on Sundays, she attended church service and helped fill the worship space with the music she loved. If Susan had any guilty pleasures at all, it was probably her devotion to the daily TV soap opera Days of Our Lives, a melodrama that she made sure to record so she could watch it every night after all her chores were done. And as soon as she hit play, she could lose herself in the stories of beautiful people whose relationships, friendships, families, marriages, and work lives were in a constant state of turmoil, like her own had so recently and secretly become. Even at home, Jeff was the only person who seemed to have any inkling of Susan's affair. Her sons, Jason and Christopher, both knew her as a loving mom who was easy to talk with and confide in, that unusual person who would listen rather than pass judgment. And Susan knew that all those traits that made her approachable and kind seemed to have been handed down to her directly from her own mother, or maybe just learned from both her parents ever since she was a child growing up on a farm 30 miles to the south in the rural town of Pauling. Susan's father, a farmer, and Susan's mother, a schoolteacher, had met in church, and while their first house had just 4 rooms, Susan and her only other sibling, a sister who was 7 years older than Susan, had always enjoyed the love and attention of their parents. And after Susan's older sister had left the farm to go to nursing school and later to settle in Connecticut, Susan also started dreaming of bigger and better things, of becoming a teacher 30 miles and a world away in the big city of nearby Poughkeepsie, population 30,000. So, after graduating from college, Susan had packed her bags, and armed with her ambitions, she had left home and headed south. But instead of becoming a teacher, she landed a job in Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where eventually, as personnel director, she would be responsible for all the activities related to hiring city employees and working out their job descriptions and benefits. And it wasn't long after her arrival in Poughkeepsie that Susan had met her future husband, Jeff Fassett, at a local bar. Like Susan, Jeff was also starting his professional career. Jeff had been born in Poughkeepsie, and after attending military college in Pennsylvania, he had returned to his hometown and joined the Poughkeepsie Police Department. A quiet, generous, and dependable man with a quick laugh, Jeff had immediately been drawn to Susan's bubbly personality, sparkling blue eyes, and a playful streak that made her fun to be around. And when Jeff and Susan, so tall in her wedding dress and heels that she could look squarely into Jeff's eyes, promised to, quote, hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until parted by death, end quote, she had meant every word of those vows. But by late afternoon on that bright Sunday, those early days of her marriage seemed so remote, Susan wondered if they had ever existed at all. Still, when she again walked into the living room, this time to ask Jeff what he would like for dinner, the finality of his simple, harsh statement to her came as a shock. Jeff looked up at Susan. "You're busted," he told her in a quiet voice. Then he turned away before saying, "Go, get out." Susan's smile slipped from her face, but before she could offer any excuses or explanations, Jeff told her that he didn't need her confession to know that she'd been having an affair. He was a cop after all. He'd seen the signs and had his suspicions now for months, maybe even years, but until now he'd never confronted her, and he'd never looked for proof. In fact, he had hoped that if Susan was cheating, she'd get it out of her system and come back to him, and they'd never even have to talk about it. But when that didn't happen, and the rumors at town hall were too loud and persistent to ignore, Jeff had recently attached a recording device to the Facets' home telephone, and sure enough, he'd heard a phone call his wife had made that left no doubt in his mind that she was not just having sex with someone else, but his wife was deeply involved with someone else. For the time being, get out meant that Susan would take what she needed for the next several days from their master bedroom and move into the small apartment once intended for Jeff's elderly mother that Jeff had built in a separate part of the house. That night, Susan lay awake in the narrow, empty bed. As she stared up at the ceiling, she thought about her life with Jeff, about all that they had done and made together, about their 2 children, and about the pleasure that both of them used to feel when they were together. It was as though someone had pulled a blindfold off of her eyes. There was suddenly no question in Susan's mind that even though her marriage was horribly damaged as a result of things she herself had done, it was worth infinitely more to her than continuing her affair. As she laid there, she wondered if there was still hope for her and Jeff. And at around midnight, as the clock clicked over to September 20th, 1999, the 24th anniversary of their marriage, Susan turned on the bedside light, then swung her long legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. Slipping on her glasses and pulling her robe tightly around her, Susan stepped to the bag she had packed that afternoon and began rummaging through her belongings. When she found the things she was looking for, she held both items tightly in her hands for a second or two before sliding them into her pocket. Straightening up, she took a deep breath, then left the little apartment and made her way to the bedroom she had so recently shared with Jeff. Once inside, she stood next to the bed and looked at her husband. "Jeff," she whispered, waking him up from a light and troubled sleep. "Would you consider reconciling?" she asked him. And then Susan reached into her pocket and took out the items she had grabbed a few minutes earlier, a cell phone and a pager she had been using to contact her lover. "Here," Susan told Jeff, handing him the 2 devices. "No more," Susan said. "I promise, it's over." A few days later, the Facets' older son, Jason, walked into their house and saw his mom and dad cuddling together on the couch. He'd known that his parents were considering the possibility of splitting up, so he was visibly surprised. When his parents noticed the strange look on his face, Jeff and Susan smiled. "We decided to stay together and try to work things out," Susan told their son. And over the next month, starting with Susan and Jeff both taking a week off work and spending every minute together, it seemed to the Facets' sons that their parents had in fact fallen back in love. Jeff and Susan had even decided to buy new wedding bands and renew their marriage vows, and both Jeff and Susan had started working together on some badly needed home improvement projects that they had been putting off for years. On Thursday, October 28th, about 5 weeks after Jeff and Susan had made the decision to reconcile, Jeff stopped by his wife's office in Poughkeepsie Town Hall. He had just picked up his new wedding band, and he wanted to show Susan how it looked. Smiling up at Jeff, Susan touched her finger to the bright, unscratched gold and agreed that the new band was perfect. Then she told her husband she'd try to be home a little early that evening so they could have a family dinner together with Jason and Christopher and the boys' girlfriends before Susan had to leave for her 7 p.m. choir practice. Throughout dinner that evening, Jeff kept stealing glances at the new gold band on his ring finger. To him, Susan's breaded chicken and green beans had never tasted so good. Now that the 2 of them had talked things out, everything about his life, from simple meals to putting on his uniform each night and heading to work in the dark, seemed a million times better. Before leaving the house for choir practice, Susan smiled as Jeff gave her a kiss and thanked her for preparing dinner. He told her he'd look forward to seeing her when she got back. Then Susan stepped outside and walked to her car. Climbing inside the Jeep, she made the short drive from her home to the big white Methodist church located at 99 Martin Road. As Susan expected, the small lot next to the church was full. After all, with Thanksgiving and Christmas fast approaching, this was a season of music when every member of the choir showed up for their 90-minute practice. But after parking in the second lot across the street, Susan did not immediately get out of her car and head across Martin Street for the church. Instead, she sat for a moment inside the quiet Jeep and thought about the pager that she had not given to Jeff back on the night of October 19th when he had confronted her about her affair. Now, as she looked up at the simple white steeple and cross lit by the church floodlights, she considered the 5 calls she had made to her lover earlier that day. And all at once, Susan could feel her chest tighten with fear. She knew that there was just so much that any husband could forgive, and there were still things Jeff didn't know, things she could not let him know, things that made it very hard for Susan to do what she absolutely needed to do: end this affair. She thought back to the incident that had happened just as she and her family were finishing dinner that night. Jeff had glanced out the window and thought he had seen someone skulking in the shadows of the driveway. His cop senses always on high alert, he'd stepped out onto the back porch for a closer look, but whoever it was, if in fact there had been anyone there at all, had melted away into the darkness. Susan gave a tiny shake and told herself to stop being ridiculous. Her lover had not been happy when she told him she wanted to end the affair, and he had demanded one more recent sexual encounter. But that was done now, and she wanted to believe that they had parted on good terms and that her lover would not do anything to hurt her or her family. And so, if there really had been a person in the driveway, Susan told herself that it was probably just someone who had gotten lost, and maybe they were thinking about asking for directions but thought better of it. And with that, Susan gathered her purse and coat, left the Jeep locked in the parking lot, and headed to the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church. An hour and a half later, at 8:36 p.m., Susan was stepping out of the church surrounded by friends, all of them chatting as they groped in pockets and purses for car keys before fanning out in different directions as they headed for the two different parking lots. For just 90 minutes, in the joy of singing, Susan had been able to forget all of her worries and guilt. And now, as she said goodbye to other choir members and made the short walk across Martin Street to her gold Jeep, parked under an overhead light in the far lot, Susan felt a rare sense of inner peace. Humming a few bars of music from the new arrangement the choir would sing this coming Sunday, Susan failed to notice that a car she didn't recognize was parked right alongside her own in the church lot. It certainly did not belong to any of the members of church choir, whose cars had become as familiar as the sound of each member's voice. Instead, without so much as a glance at the car or the person who sat inside, Susan stepped to the driver's side of her Jeep, unlocked the door, and climbed behind the wheel. Closing the car door, Susan put the key in the ignition, turned on the car and headlights, then reached up to her left to pull the seatbelt down across her lap. A moment later, the cold, clear night outside the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church was shattered by the sound of 6 gunshots, and then the kick of gravel as the car that had been parked next to Susan's peeled out of the church lot and was almost immediately swallowed up by the thin ribbon of traffic along Route 72 out of town. Within moments of the shots, members of the church choir were either pulling out their cell phones or darting back into the church to call 911. At the same time, a few others headed for the far lot where the gunshots had come from, and where at least one person saw an older model light-colored station wagon speeding to the parking lot exit. By the time the first ambulance had arrived at the United Methodist Church, one of Susan's friends was sitting hunched over on the ground next to Susan's car, their arms cradling Susan's head and shoulders. When the first bullet had shattered the driver's side window of the gold Jeep Cherokee, Susan, her seatbelt not yet securely fastened, must have reached instinctively for her car door so she could jump down and try to escape the attack. Instead, when the door opened, Susan had tumbled out, and by the time her friend had reached her, Susan was slumped against the side of her car, her neck dark with blood, but still alive. Even as the ambulance carrying Susan had raced off to St. Francis Hospital in Poughkeepsie, the lead detective in the case was already on his way to the crime scene. Arthur Boyko, a lieutenant with the New York State Police, had been notified of a shooting and possible dead body at the United Methodist Church parking lot in Pleasant Valley. Detective Boyko knew exactly where that church was located. Assigned to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, he worked with Troop K in a barracks located at the edge of Pleasant Valley, fewer than 5 miles from the church. By the time Detective Boyko arrived at the church, local police had secured the scene with yellow crime scene tape and were doing their best to keep potential witnesses separate from the growing crowd of onlookers. Tall, lean, and commanding with his thin face and military-style haircut, the 34-year-old detective immediately took charge of the situation. And right away, he knew that this investigation would be very, very complicated. Because in the same breath that choir members gave first responders the name of the victim, Susan Fassett, they also told officers that Susan's husband was a cop, a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Even before forming any first impressions of the crime scene, investigator Boyko knew that most murders and attempted homicides are committed by people close to the victim. And that made Jeff Fassett an immediate person of interest, especially since, as a police officer, Jeff had a gun, a service weapon that had to be secured and tested as soon as possible. At the same time, the detective also needed to make sure that Jeff and his sons were informed of the attack on Susan. And if Susan was still alive, her family deserved the chance to visit her right away at the hospital. The decision about whether to question Jeff as a suspect or just inform him of the attack on Susan and let him go see her was made for the investigator when one of the witnesses to the shooting said that the car that had been parked next to Susan's belonged to Jeff Fassett. Operating on the assumption that Jeff was armed and dangerous and may even try to harm other family members who might be inside the house with him, police immediately organized a Special Weapons and Tactics Team, or SWAT team, to surround the Fassett house and take Jeff and anyone else inside the house into police custody. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Detective Boyko had assigned officers to carry out interviews with eyewitnesses, along with Susan's friends, neighbors, and co-workers at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. In making a close survey of the scene and hearing initial eyewitness accounts, the detective had also arrived at several important conclusions. As crime scene techs collected and photographed evidence and dusted for fingerprints, Detective Boyko had decided that this was not some random attack or attempted robbery. No one had taken Susan's personal belongings, including her purse, which were still in plain sight on the front passenger seat, and whoever had attacked Susan must have been lying in wait for her, which suggested that not only was Susan the specific target of the attack, but that her would-be killer knew something about Susan's routines and expected that Susan would be at that church that night for choir practice. But the pattern of gunfire also made it unlikely that this was an execution-style hit. Not only did Susan seem like a very unlikely target for that, first responders had also reported that none of the bullets were clustered around Susan's head like you would expect in an execution-style hit. Instead, her attacker had fired a spray of bullets, including one that had missed its mark completely and instead lodged in the doorframe of Susan's car. By the time police had Jeff, his two sons, and their girlfriends lying face down and handcuffed on the gravel driveway outside of the Fassett home, it was 11 p.m. and Susan had already died of her injuries. And for the next 16 hours, police interrogated Jeff about his wife's murder, even as his sons sat handcuffed to separate desks inside the local police station. All Jeff and the boys had been able to find out during a tense 2-hour standoff with the SWAT team that had surrounded their house was that Susan had been shot at the United Methodist Church. Although Jeff declared his innocence and answered every question in a calm, neutral voice, he had been a cop long enough to know that things looked very bad for him. While Susan was at choir practice, he had left his house and driven to Poughkeepsie to get his paycheck. So not only had an eyewitness ID'd Jeff's car as the one leaving the scene of the crime, Jeff also had no alibi for the time of the murder. And police had discovered that Jeff had a very strong motive for this murder. If Susan thought she had kept her affair a secret from those around her, she was mistaken. In no time, neighbors and co-workers had reported to police that Susan Fassett was having an affair. Not only that, but as Jeff told police, just weeks earlier, he had confronted Susan's affair partner with his suspicions right in the middle of Jeff's office inside the Poughkeepsie Police Department. But throughout that long night of questioning, Jeff never wavered from his absolute insistence that he had nothing to do with his wife's brutal murder. And he also never wavered from telling police that if they wanted to find his wife's killer, they should go talk with the man she'd been seeing outside of their marriage. "You can turn on the hot lights," Jeff told the lie detector expert from the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation. "Beat me with rubber hoses. But when you're all done with me and you get me out of the way, you go see Fred Andros. He did this. He's involved in this." The identity of Susan's affair partner and his possible involvement in her murder sent shockwaves through every level of the investigation, even making its way into the regional offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. It also sent shockwaves through Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where Fred Andrus had worked, until recently, as the head of the town's water department. Because Fred Andrus's name was already widely and publicly linked to serious criminal activity. Back in May of 1999, just 5 months before Susan's murder, Fred had been forced to resign his job as water superintendent after he was caught collecting bribes for a man named William Paroli. the most powerful political operative in the Poughkeepsie Republican Party. And one day after Fred resigned, he pled guilty to corruption charges and struck a deal with the FBI. In exchange for a lesser sentence, Fred had agreed to testify against William Paroli, who was charged with running a widespread shakedown operation of local contractors for the previous 6 years. And not only was Fred Andrus a known thief and liar, he was also a well-known womanizer. Despite his bullet-shaped head, small facial features, and Elvis-like pompadour all stacked on top of his 5'7" overweight body, Fred was on his 4th marriage, a fact that did not stop him from regularly soliciting the services of Poughkeepsie area prostitutes. The connection between Fred and Susan, confirmed by Jeff, opened the door to all kinds of new leads in the investigation. If it wasn't Jeff who killed his wife in a jealous rage, was it Fred? Was it Fred's wife? If Fred was involved with multiple women, could one of them have viewed Susan as a rival and decided to kill her? Or did Susan, because of her close association with Fred, know something about the ongoing corruption probe that made her a target of assassination? By 4 a.m. on the morning of October 29th, while Jeff was still being questioned at the Pleasant Valley Police Station, investigator Boyko was sitting across the table from Fred inside Fred's comfortable 3-story home located in a nice part of Poughkeepsie called Hyde Park. And within minutes of talking to Fred, the detective was aware that Fred, despite his less-than-handsome appearance, possessed a certain charm and confidence. He also had an airtight alibi for the evening of Susan's murder. From 7 to 9 p.m. the previous night, Fred and his wife had spent the evening with friends, a retired Poughkeepsie police officer and his wife. The men had spent most of the evening down in Fred's basement building very sophisticated model airplanes, which was a hobby the two friends shared. As for his relationship with Susan, Fred would confirm that he had been having a 4-year-long affair with Susan, and that they had actually known each other for 16 years before that. Fred also confirmed that Susan had wanted to end their affair after her confrontation with her husband Jeff back in mid-September, but Fred insisted that it had been a mutual decision to end the affair. And when the two of them had broken it off back in September, Fred had made a full confession to his own wife, who had been generous enough to forgive him. When asked when he had last seen or had a sexual encounter with Susan, Fred disclosed that he was actually impotent and that the physical part of his relationship with Susan consisted of cuddling and kissing and companionship. According to Fred, the last time he and Susan had actually had sexual intercourse was 1.5 years ago. Although Fred was obviously distressed by the news that Susan was dead, the only subject that seemed to make the disgraced town official nervous was whether the murder could have anything to do with the ongoing corruption probe at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. Fred admitted that now that he was a witness for the FBI, he felt like he could be in danger from local bad guys. And Fred also admitted that it was possible Susan could have been in danger just because of him. Contrary to what Detective Boyko heard, that Susan's affair with Fred seemed to be public knowledge, Fred insisted that he and Susan had kept their relationship a very closely guarded secret. It seemed like a small discrepancy, but one that the investigator knew he would have to follow up on. Meanwhile, detectives also began to collect all of the communication data, telephone, pager, cell phone, and email that belonged to the key figures in the case, including Susan, Fred, and Jeff. With the help of technology experts, investigators hoped to compile a picture of who was where and who was talking to whom in the days and weeks leading up to Susan's murder. The first break in the case came on October 30th, 2 days after Susan's murder. Partial results from Susan's autopsy had revealed traces of semen inside of Susan, meaning she must have had intercourse between 24 and 48 hours before she had died. Hours later, Jeff was brought back to the police station where he told detectives that the last time he and Susan had made love was 4 or 5 days before she was killed. An analysis of the blood sample Jeff gave police, along with the results of a lie detector test he also agreed to take, confirmed Jeff's story. And after seeing pictures of Jeff's car, the woman who had placed his car in the church parking lot on the night of the murder also told police that she actually might have been mistaken. It might have been a different car. While police were still not willing to rule Jeff out as a suspect, they now knew that they had to find the man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. Unfortunately, the problem with this new piece of physical evidence was that police simply had no other suspects aside from Jeff against whom they could match the semen sample. So, even though police had ruled Fred Andros out as the murderer, Detective Boyko decided it was still worth following up with him, as well as with Jeff, to see if either man could shed additional light on what was happening in Susan's life or in her past that might provide any clues to her murder. Because Fred had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, and police had no evidence that linked him to the crime, there was no legal way to compel Fred to give them a DNA sample so they could rule him out as the mystery man who last had sex with Susan Fassett. But when Fred declined the investigators' request for such a sample, there was nothing to prevent Investigator Boyko from inviting Fred to have lunch with him in a public place, and then for the detective to collect a DNA sample by pocketing the straw that Fred had used to sip from his cup of water. Besides, after hearing rumors that Fred regularly solicited sex from prostitutes, investigators had to wonder if Fred had been lying when he told them he was unable to have sex. But it wasn't until mid-December, 1.5 months after Susan was gunned down, that Detective Boyko and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation would get the tip they needed to break the murder case wide open. And the story that investigators ultimately pieced together would make Susan's favorite soap opera, Days of Our Lives, look like a happy fairy tale written for kids. Based on what investigators discovered, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of Thursday, October 28th, when Susan left the United Methodist Church in Pleasant Valley and hummed her way across the parking lot to her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee. As soon as the killer arrived at the church, they saw that their timing was perfect. Susan's distinctive Jeep was parked in the lot farther away from the church, and there were several empty slots on either side of the Jeep. A moment later, the killer had backed the old Taurus station wagon with the fake license plates into the empty space next to the Jeep. Now, the front passenger seat of the Taurus was directly across from the driver's side of the Jeep. As the killer hoisted their bulky frame from the driver's side into the passenger seat, they put the passenger side seat back all the way so anyone looking at the Taurus would think the car was empty. Reclining in the dark, the killer tried to slow their racing heart. Earlier that evening, the killer had actually gone directly to Susan's house to see if they could get a clean shot at her while she was eating dinner with her family, or if she stepped outside alone onto the back porch. But the killer had barely made it halfway up the driveway before Susan's husband had suddenly come out the back door and begun to make a slow circuit of the house while calling out if anyone was out there. That had been even worse than what had happened 4 days earlier, on Monday, October 25th, when the killer had driven to the Pleasant Valley Jewish Community Center, intending to kill Susan there, but the center had been too crowded, and Susan's car wasn't there, so the killer had just left. But now there was no turning back. It had been made very clear to the killer that Susan was not dead by the end of tonight, that very bad things would happen to the killer's own family. Closing their eyes in the dark, the killer could see the photographs spread out on the kitchen table in front of them. The killer's son, each sibling, each aunt, each stepchild, all pictured alone, all vulnerable to some terrible accident, including murder. It would be a shame if anything happened to them, the person sitting across the table had said in that low monotone that had somehow always sounded so threatening and dangerous. The choice was clear: Susan or the killer's own loved ones. And at 4 p.m. that afternoon, the killer was driving away from their home in the Catskill Mountains, 1 hour south to Pleasant Valley. Along the way, the killer stopped at a local Kmart near the Fassett home and bought shoes, a t-shirt, a black full-face ski mask, and a bottle of pain pills for the headache that now never seemed to go away. A little further on, the killer pulled into a Dunkin' Donuts coffee shop and bought 24 donuts and then crammed them one after the other into their mouth. There had been an added incentive: get rid of Susan, and the killer would not have to pay back that loan, which now totaled over $10,000. Yes, the decision to go directly to Susan's house had been stupid, but there was no harm done. And now the killer was perfectly placed to make the kill and then forget that any of this had ever happened. The reason Susan had to die was so she could never testify in court about the corruption case. But sitting here now, the killer decided that for the person who had set this plot in motion, the real motive here was revenge. A moment later, the killer checked their watch and then reached over to the .45 caliber Ruger on the seat next to them. It was almost time. And sure enough, just after 8:30 p.m., the killer could see the doors of the church open, and in the light that spilled out, the killer had no trouble recognizing Susan's tall figure and white blonde curls. After exchanging goodbyes with other members of the choir, Susan stepped out from the group and started making her way across Martin Street toward the second parking lot. The killer stared at Susan in fascination. They had only been together 5 times, but the killer knew every inch of those long legs and feel of Susan's solid hips, back, chest, arms, and mouth. But aside from knowing Susan's body, the killer felt no connection to the woman they were about to kill. It wasn't like they had ever been in a relationship with one another. A minute later, and Susan had walked to the driver's side of her Jeep, opened the door, and tossed her purse onto the passenger seat. The killer lay back, still reclining, until Susan had climbed into the Jeep and started the engine. Then, sitting up, the killer leveled the gun at Susan and started pulling the trigger. The first shot shattered the window on the driver's side of the Jeep. That same bullet also passed directly through Susan's neck, hitting 2 major arteries. As Susan opened her door and tumbled out of the car, the killer shot 5 more rounds. 4 of those bullets would lodge into Susan's body. The 5th would lodge into the driver's side doorframe of her Jeep. 2 of the shots were fatal. Even as medics would later rush Susan to the hospital, she was already dying, and there was nothing anyone could have done to save her. As soon as the gun was empty, the killer shifted back into the driver's seat and took off out of the church parking lot. On their way home, the killer dropped off the garbage bag containing the gun, gloves, and ski mask at the prearranged location alongside of a nearby road. Then, Susan's sexual partner, a 50-year-old woman named Dawn Silvernail, stopped outside of a convenience store in Hyde Park, Poughkeepsie. Before heading back to her house and husband up in the Catskills, Dawn called her other sexual partner, Fred Andrus, on his pager. As soon as the device connected, Dawn carefully typed in the numbers 666, the agreed-upon code that would let Fred know that Susan Fassett, the third member of their sexual threesome, and the woman who had dared to leave him, was now dead. It would turn out that it was Fred who had planned and orchestrated Susan's murder by coercing another one of his lovers to kill Susan. But it wasn't until mid-December that Fred revealed the name of the woman who had actually fired the shots that killed Susan. That was when an analysis of the DNA from Fred's drinking straw confirmed that Fred was the mystery man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. By the time Jeff Fassett had confronted his wife back in mid-September with proof that he knew about her affair with Fred Andrus, Susan already knew that when it came to Fred, she was in way over her head. What had started as an affair 4 years earlier had become a relationship that Fred used to play out his own sexual fantasies. He made that easier for himself by getting Jeff Fassett moved to an overnight shift so Fred would have better access to Susan. In addition to Fred's relationship with Susan, he had also been involved with a woman named Dawn Silvernail. The two had first met back in 1977 over Citizens Band Radio, where Fred went by the name Neptune and Dawn went by the name Footloose. After meeting in person a year later, the two began a sexual relationship that would continue on and off for more than 20 years, during which time Fred would marry and divorce multiple times, and Dawn would marry and settle in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. Over the years, Fred had loaned Dawn about $15,000, which Dawn started paying back by performing sex acts for Fred, including having sex with Fred's friends and acquaintances. And by the summer of 1999, Fred had developed a taste for watching 2 women have sex with each other and then joining in to make it a threesome. It was then that Fred started recruiting and paying Dawn to have sex with Susan. The encounters would usually take place on the concrete floor of one of Poughkeepsie's several water pumping stations, except for the first encounter, which Fred staged in his own basement and which he videotaped from start to finish. After Susan ended her affair with Fred in mid-September, Susan's family believes that Fred, enraged by the rejection, may have threatened either to harm Susan's family or to reveal the contents of that sex tape unless she continued to see him. Once Fred was confronted in mid-December by investigators who now had proof that Fred had been lying to them all along about his involvement with Susan, Fred tried to save himself by pointing the finger at Dawn and insisting that Susan's death was the result of a lover's quarrel between the two women. But when interrogated by police, Dawn eventually laid out every detail of the murder plot devised by Fred Andrus and handed over to police the gun she had used to kill Susan. And Dawn's story would be backed up by an analysis of phone and pager records belonging to Fred, Dawn, and Susan. The data showed that Dawn had called and talked with Fred several times on the day of Susan's murder, and that Dawn had paged Fred from the convenience store near his home shortly after she had committed the murder. According to Dawn, Fred had insisted that Susan had to die so she could never testify against him in court about his involvement in the Poughkeepsie corruption scandal, except that federal agents insisted that Susan had no involvement in that corruption probe and no information that could affect the case one way or another. But before police could arrest Fred, there would be one more unbelievable twist to this bizarre and tragic crime. On December 30th, 1999, 2 months after Susan's murder, police were inside the Andrus house executing a search warrant when they heard a single gunshot up in the attic. Realizing that he would be prosecuted for murder, Fred had attempted suicide by holding a gun to his chin and pulling the trigger. But instead of traveling up into his brain, the bullet glanced off the bone in Fred's jaw, and instead of killing him, it blew away the lower part of his face. Fred would survive the self-inflicted injury, and on February 23, 2001, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy in the first degree in the death of Susan Fassett. The two charges would carry a combined prison sentence of 50 years to life. On March 16, 2001, Dawn Silvernail, who had accepted a guilty plea in exchange for testifying against Fred Andrus, was sentenced to 18 years to life for killing Susan Fassett. 1 year and 9 months into his prison sentence, at the age of 63, Fred Andrus died of an apparent heart attack at the Clinton Correctional Center in New York. Dawn Silvernail was released from prison after serving 16 years. She died 3 years later at the age of 70. Susan's husband, Jeff Fassett, remarried 5 years after Susan's death, and 2 years later retired from the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Jeff would die of cancer in 2018 at the age of 67. In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail, so it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, Is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road. But she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but she couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent, she zips it up, and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up, she is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn, she doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning, she jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark and they were gonna finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break and she effectively made this whole situation up, that she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. On June 7th, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together, and that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone, and they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids, and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them, and they're starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them. And so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here. And that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking: how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them. Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not gonna not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this, this is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine. But I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I can tell you right now, there's no way they could cover a 3.5 mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police, they're happy, and everybody moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match much he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnerdys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at, and for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off, and then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up, and so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is on the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen, and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up, in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location, and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road, or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points, and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar, and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it, and when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia. And so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around, he got scared, he thought somebody was chasing him, and then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone's following me," but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help, he would seek safety, but he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off, and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them will go unanswered. So that's going to